In the heart of a city that never seemed to sleep, where the neon lights hummed with the rhythm of commerce and the streets were paved with the hurried footsteps of the ambitious, there lived a woman named Anne. To any casual observer, Anne was a model of order and potential. Her small apartment was a sanctuary of organization, filled with stacks of leather-bound journals and mood boards pinned with vibrant inspirations. She was a woman who lived in the light of the future, a master architect of the next. Anne possessed a brilliant mind and a heart full of grand designs. She dreamed of opening a sanctuary for reclaimed art, a place where forgotten objects could find a new soul. She had the sketches for the floor plan, the list of potential suppliers, and even the color palette for the grand opening invitations. But there was a silent, invisible weight that anchored Anne to her present reality, the comfort of the plan. For years, Anne had told herself that she was simply preparing. She believed that the perfect life required a perfect foundation, and a perfect foundation required an infinite amount of time to curate. She was waiting for the winds to be just right, for her bank account to hit a specific number, and for her confidence to reach a peak that never seemed to arrive. Every morning, Anne would wake up, brew a cup of tea, and open her latest journal. She would write down magnificent goals, her pen gliding across the paper with the grace of a dancer. But when the clock struck 8, and it was time to head to her mundane administrative job, those journals were closed. The dreams were tucked away for tomorrow. She lived in a perpetual state of rehearsal, never once stepping onto the stage. She convinced herself that the act of planning was the same as the act of building. She was a curator of possibilities, but a ghost in her own reality. The turning point came on a Tuesday, an unremarkable day that carried the weight of a decade of delay. Anne was sitting in a park, watching an elderly man carve a piece of wood. He wasn't using a blueprint or a sophisticated tool set. He simply had a small knife and a rough branch. With every steady stroke, shavings of wood fell to the grass, and a shape began to emerge. Anne watched him for an hour, mesmerized by the simplicity of his labor. "That's a beautiful bird you're making," she finally said, leaning in. The man looked up, his eyes crinkled with age and wisdom. "It's not a bird yet," he replied, "but it's more of a bird than it was this morning. Most people spend their lives looking at the wood, imagining the wings, and waiting for the perfect knife. But the bird only appears because the knife meets the wood today." Those words struck a chord deep within Anne. She looked down at her own hands, clutching a notebook filled with ideas for a life she hadn't yet touched. She realized that her journals were not bridges to her future, they were beautiful cages. She had been so afraid of making a mistake, of creating something imperfect, that she had chosen to create nothing at all. She was an expert on the tomorrow that never came, while her today was evaporating into the ether. That evening, Anne did not open her journal to plan. Instead, she cleared her dining table. She took a single canvas she had bought 3 years ago and stripped away the plastic wrap. Her hands shook as she squeezed out the first dollop of paint. It wasn't the perfect color, and she didn't have the ideal lighting, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting, she was doing. The first few strokes were clumsy. The image in her head didn't match the reality on the canvas, and the old voice of perfectionism screamed at her to stop and plan better. But Anne pushed through. She traded the safety of her thoughts for the friction of action. The weeks that followed were not a montage of instant success, but a grueling process of construction. Anne began to wake up an hour earlier, not to write lists, but to work. She reached out to local artists, not to discuss someday, but to ask for advice on now. She faced rejections, she made financial mistakes, and there were nights when she felt completely overwhelmed. However, something miraculous happened. The more she worked in the messy, unpredictable reality of the present, the more her dream life began to materialize. It wasn't arriving as a finished gift from the future. It was being forged in the heat of her daily efforts. The climax of her journey arrived when a small gallery space in an old industrial district became available. It was smaller than her plans had dictated, and the rent was a bit higher than her tomorrow budget allowed. The old Anne would have spent weeks analyzing the risks, ultimately convincing herself to wait for a better option. But the new Anne, the one who understood the value of the present, took the leap. She signed the lease with trembling fingers and spent the next month scrubbing floors, painting walls, and installing lights. She didn't have a grand opening team. She had her own 2 hands and the sweat of her brow. On the night her sanctuary finally opened, the air was filled with the scent of fresh paint and the murmur of curious visitors. The reclaimed art on the walls wasn't perfect, but it was real. As Anne stood in the center of the room, she realized that her life felt more vibrant than any journal entry she had ever written. She looked at a small wooden bird perched on a shelf, a gift from the man in the park, and smiled. She understood now that the life she had always wanted wasn't waiting for her at the end of a long road of planning. It was hidden in the small, often difficult choices she made every single morning. The bridge between a dream and a reality is not built with thoughts, but with the bricks of action laid down one day at a time. Her dream life was no longer a distant horizon. It was the ground beneath her feet, built firmly on what she chose to do today, leaving no more room for the empty promises of tomorrow.